to Vinyl Friday, where I go through my records in alphabetical order like a big nerd. As you can see, this week is another Revolver week. Indeed, it is our second Revolver week, which means that we will be looking at one of the Beatles' best composed pieces of music ever. There, I said it, let's go. We're listening to Eleanor, Rigby. Okay, so this isn't one of my favorite songs to listen to. Like, I don't listen to this because I just really love this song so much, but I do really love this song, and I really respect it for its overall quality. This is a really high caliber song, and today we're going to break it down into three constituent elements: the orchestration, the lyrics, and the melody / song structure. I'm really excited to start with the orchestration. None of the Beatles are playing on this song. Three of them are singing on it, but nobody from the Beatles is actually playing an instrument on this recording. Everything that is happening behind the vocals was written by George Martin in what I believe to be a stellar piece of composition that displays his understated talent as a writer. This arrangement is raw and it's hard-hitting, but it maintains an elegance throughout. This song alone provides enough evidence for me that George Martin is the fifth Beatle. Like Mal Evans, Brian Epstein, Jeff Emmerich even. They're great and they're integral to the Beatles story, but if you're gonna nominate a fifth Beatle, in my mind, there is none other than George Martin who could take that spot. So, what's so great about this arrangement, you ask? Now, of course you don't ask. Everyone thinks this is a great arrangement, right? That's the world that I choose to live in. Well, it was inspired by the score from Psycho, which you can hear in these strings here. Lovely. Now, I will concede that this arrangement is not without precedent. Obviously, its predecessor is Yesterday, which featured, I believe, a string quartet. There are a number of key differences, I think, between Yesterday and Eleanor Rigby. The first is that Paul kind of had to be cajoled into allowing a string quartet on a Beatles recording when they recorded Yesterday, because up until that point, their music was pretty much exclusively performed as a rock and roll lineup with the guitars and the drum and the bass. In the context, other songs that featured strings were really syrupy, not gritty enough for the Beatles. I guess they sort of felt like they were selling out by including a track on their album that had a heavy string section. By the time Revolver comes around, it's wild to believe it's only been a year, but a lot has happened in that year. One of those things that has happened is that Paul's girlfriend, Jane Asher, has introduced him to Vivaldi. And is taking him to these classical music concerts. So now, Paul McCartney feels like classical music is cultured and that it would be actually kind of a radical move to have strings on your recording. So whereas with Yesterday, George Martin was imploring Paul to put strings on his recording, in this case, Paul is asking George Martin if he'll put something together for this song. And boy does George Martin deliver! So there's a sort of almost a role reversal that's happening there. If you listen to Anthology 2 or the Super Deluxe version of the 2022 release of Revolver, there's a lovely moment right before the beginning of the second instrumental take where George Martin says,
"Stop me if the tempo's not fast enough, Paul."
So George Martin is the person who's on the floor of the studio. Paul is the person who's behind the controls, in the driver's seat, in the control room. And George Martin is taking instruction from Paul. If you had to summarize what it is that makes this song special, I think it's the beautiful relationship between Paul McCartney as a strong songwriter and budding arranger, and his kind of mentor, George Martin, who in a way is having his own creative boundaries pushed by performing with this group of guys who keep demanding things that are seemingly impossible. It's invigorating. Another way that this arrangement is different from Yesterday is that it hits harder. Whereas Yesterday is melancholy and flowing gently, this is rough and raw we've got short clipped staccato notes like this. It's also mournful like Yesterday, but it's so frantic and so fraught. Part of what makes it that is that Geoff Emerick, boy wonder, the engineer on this recording session, stuck the microphones right up close against the strings, which he did throughout this album. Like, he had the microphones right up close against the amplifiers. He had them basically in the bells of the brass instruments on we'll get to that, Got to Get You Into My Life. We're not there yet. He did the same thing on this one. So the microphones were right up against the instruments when they were recording this. It's a string octet, so it's basically 2 string quartets, or one is doubling what the other is doing, which gives it body and texture. So that is a collection of violins, violas, and cellos. And apparently when Geoff Emerick was setting up the microphones, the string players were sort of scolding him and saying, "You're not meant to do it like that. They're too close to the instruments." They were concerned that they wouldn't be able to play their instruments properly because there was a microphone in the way. So they kept shuffling their chairs backwards. Eventually, George Martin from the control room had to get on this sort of like intercom thing that you used to talk to the people in the studio and tell them, "Stop moving the chairs!" The imagery of this I find so funny. So I think it's time we get into the nitty-gritty and break down why this is so brilliant. The Beatles, most unfortunately, are blockers, which means that I have to be really careful about how much of their songs I feature in the videos. Even though I'm not trying to profit from them, I'm trying to pontificate about how much I love them. Whatever, that's how the music industry in 2024 works. And as I don't want to be hunted down and tried for my Beatle crimes, I've had to recreate the string section. Bowed instruments are not my strong suit, so it is on guitars instead of cellos, violas, and violins. But I've done my very best to include... Hello, how's it going? I have done my very best to capture all of the elements of the song. Here it is.
1, 2, 3, 4.
things that I love about this arrangement is that George Martin approaches every verse differently. He never phones it in. He never goes, this is how the arrangement goes, play it through to the rest of the song. He gives every section of the song its due attention and the detail that it requires to help Paul McCartney tell his story. Let's break it down further. Now, because I don't have the same instrumentation as they did, I'm going to speak not in terms of the individual instruments, but in terms of the sort of frequency ranges. So we'll be talking about the lower instruments, the middle instruments, and the high instruments. That's just referring to the frequencies where they sit. High, middle, low. Good. Verse 1 is very straightforward. It's sort of like what the arrangement sounds like at its very simplest. When we listen to it the second time, the middle range instruments double their pace. So if the first time through they're doing this, the second time they're doing this. In the second verse, the lower instruments get a little moment of showcase right here. The second time they are joined by a mid-range melody. Very nice, very tasteful. In the third verse, the middle section instruments get very busy. And above them is this gently flowing high part. And then in the fourth verse, we get this frantic striking. And underneath that, the lower frequency instruments take on the melody in unison with Paul McCartney's vocals, like this. Aren't all of those elements incredible? There's such attention to detail here. This is what I mean when I say that he's never phoning it in. He's giving each of these moments in the song a little bit to set them apart from all of the others. There's hardly any repetition. And in that, it is stunning on its own, but it never steps on Paul McCartney's vocals. For instance, almost all of the melodic runs in these string parts respond to the vocal parts. I'll show you what I mean. Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and John Lennon sing ah. Once they've established that, the lower instruments step up, and then our three singers sing look at all the lonely people, and once they've finished that, the bass steps down, like so. So that bum 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 never sits on top of the vocal, because if you put them on top of each other, each would pull focus from the other. And then this very distinctive, very recognizable melody line played on, I believe, the violins. That's happening when nobody is singing. There is space for the string section to get really busy because nothing else is happening. As soon as Paul starts singing the verse, everyone falls back into formation. None of the instruments are getting too big for their boots.
Eleanor, Rigby.
No singing? Vocals. See how these accents happen as soon as Paul McCartney takes a break. So there's always something interesting for us to listen to, but never coinciding in a way that's unpleasant to listen to. Oh, lovely. Or there's a melody run somewhere around the middle of the song that goes do 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 do. It catches all of the high notes of the melody and they coincide at the same time, so it's sort of riding on the back of the vocals, even harmonizing with the vocals. Let's listen. So those are all points where the vocals are being accentuated anyway. Socks in the night when there's nobody there. We get it a little later in the song as well, like this. The string arrangement is picking up those accents and highlighting them, augmenting them even. And then my last example, of course, is this. In the final verse, when the bottom instruments pick up the melody and play in unison with Paul McCartney's melody, like this. And that do-do-do-do, the little busy part there happens before he starts singing, and then as soon as he starts singing, the bass does something a little bit more sedate. It's genius arranging. Just stunning. Such good work. And then on top of that, it sounds great. It's not just the cleverness of it. It is so pleasant to listen to. So affecting. So moving. It's beautiful in its own right. Each little part is slightly different so that it draws and holds your attention so that Paul McCartney can tell his beautiful story. It is such a beautiful collaboration between two incredibly creative people. I genuinely think that this is one of George Martin's most impressive contributions to any Beatles song. Hats off to you, my friend. Let's dig into the lyrics. Generally, I feel that Paul McCartney is a weaker lyricist than John Lennon. I have stated this in the past, and it stirred up a lot of controversy, but I am standing by what I said. And I would once again like to submit Exhibit A as evidence to my case.
Well, something took a hold of me, and I acted like a dustbin lid.
What does that even mean? What are you trying to communicate, man? Having said that, I think that Eleanor Rigby is one of his best efforts. Again, ever, in any song that he's written. This man has written a lot of songs, and this, I think, is one of his best lyrical efforts. It depicts a rich story of two people living lives of quiet, bleak isolation. More importantly though, it shows rather than tells. And I think that that is the mark of a good lyricist. The song is heavy on imagery. Apparently that's how this started for Paul McCartney. The idea of picks up the rice in the church where a wedding has been. That doesn't say this person is lonely, although we do get to that in the chorus. It says this is someone who never gets to attend the wedding. She just cleans up after them by herself. Or Father Mackenzie darning his socks in the night when there's nobody there. Even the way that the vocals are inflected, they're so emphatic. He's darning his socks in the night when there's nobody there. It's almost conversational, but it is so much more musical than that at the same time. Genius. Or even the idea that Father Mackenzie is writing his sermon and no one's gonna listen to it. I think maybe that's the most tragic thing about it. In theory, I think churches are meant to be about community, and here is this man who leads, presumably, a congregation, except it's empty and there's no one there. So not only is he doing all of this by himself, he's doing it for no one. Again, I think that the best lyrics evoke. They don't tell us overtly, there's this woman and she lives by herself and she's super lonely and nothing interesting happens to her. Also, there's this man, he also lives by himself, nothing much is happening in his life. They don't need to tell us that because all of these peripheral details of their life come together and show us. Now, I must say, I have said that this is one of Paul's best lyrical efforts, but apparently this was a very collaboratively written song, with each Beatle contributing some element of the lyrics. An element I like about the lyrics is how Paul McCartney has deliberately chosen plain names. He speaks to this in Anthology, so I think it's time for us to pay a visit to the Storytime correspondent. Over to you, my friend. Hello there. As always, we will be taking today's reading from The Good Book. Paul says, I had a bit of trouble with the name, and I'm always keen to get a name that sounds right. Looking at my old school photographs, I remembered the names, and they all work. James Stringfellow, Grace Pendleton, whereas when you read novels, it's all James Turnberry, and it's not real. So I was very keen to get a real sounding name for the tune and the whole idea. I also like the idea that they are separate but tangentially related characters whose orbits almost come into contact with each other, but they kind of miss each other. So you have these two very separately lonely people, and they really only come together explicitly when Father Mackenzie is... It is an interestingly bleak ending to the song. Nobody gets their redemption, nobody makes any friends. They just die. And there's no one at the funeral, and there's no one in the church. The end. Again, much like Taxman, this is definitely not a love song. It is not even close to a love song. It is, I mean, you could argue that it's an absence of love song, but no, it's not a love song at all. That's something that I find really engaging and interesting about this song. I think it's time for us to talk about the melody of this song. This is a song that has a handsome, poignant melody. It's good. Here's how I usually judge the quality of a melody. Bear in mind, this does not mean that I'm judging the quality of the song specifically, but I think that a song has an engaging and interesting melody when it can stand on its own without lyrics, when you can play it instrumentally and it still sounds really good. I think this song meets that criterion. Let's put it to the piano correspondent to prove that theory. Yes, let's test that theory. That sounds pretty good without vocals. An example of a song that doesn't necessarily translate as well melodically to an instrumental version is I Am the Walrus.
editor's note. Having said that, jazz pianist Brad Meldau does a cover of I Am the Walrus that I think is one of the best covers that anybody has ever done of a Beatles song. So you can make music out of anything, really.
And don't get me wrong, I am not saying that I Am the Walrus doesn't have its merits. Indeed, I think it might be one of John Lennon's top 5 vocal performances, personally, but it doesn't have the melodic prowess, or finesse maybe, that Eleanor Rigby does. I mean, it's so sweet. I'm gonna sit here and play that a few more times and let you get back to the show. It's an odd structure because it has this refrain that is neither a verse nor a chorus. It opens with it, it closes with it. It's like the song's bookend. It's separate from the other parts of the song, and it works. It still works really well. I especially love that they bring that back at the end so that it acts as a counterpoint to the melody of the chorus. Paul sings that top note so beautifully and so clearly. You really hear the sweetness to his voice. Something about the way that they have brought that back in makes it feel so much more vulnerable and lonely, because all of the other times in the song, that's sung by 3 people. I think this is a clever bit of arrangement, because when they're singing about all the lonely people, there's a small group of them. But when Paul is singing specifically about the individual characters of the song, it's not even double-tracked. It's just his voice on its own. And then at the very end, when they bring that refrain back, that is usually sung by the 3, it's just Paul on his own. And it makes it so much more melancholy and mournful. That's basically everything I had to say about this song. There is one last point, which is that Paul was certain that he had gotten the name Eleanor Rigby from a combination of Eleanor Braun, who I think was the lead actress in the Help movie, and the name Rigby, which he had seen on a storefront in Bristol. Bristol? Brighton? Somewhere in Britain. And he thought, that's a good name, I'll put those together. However, Paul McCartney first saw John Lennon perform at St. Peter's Church in Woolton Village. Behind the church is a cemetery, and in that cemetery is a grave for a woman named Eleanor Rigby. Paul McCartney says, "It was either complete coincidence or in my subconscious. I suppose it was more likely in my subconscious because I will have been amongst those graves knocking around with John and wandering through there. It was the sort of place we used to sunbathe." Is that what they were doing? Cutting school. Or as we call it in New Zealand, wagging. Wagging school. Coincidence is just a word that says 2 things coincided, but as to why they happened together, there are probably far deeper reasons than our little brains can grasp. And not too far from Eleanor Rigby's grave is a grave for a John Mackenzie. And that little detail makes the last line of the song, wiping the dirt from his hands as he walked from her grave, all the more poignant. So I guess the question is it a really, really bizarre coincidence? Or was that just buried deep within Paul McCartney's subconscious and it resurfaced in his brain in early 1966? Who knows? So let's conclude. Eleanor Rigby is a song that is unabashedly poignant, it is expertly melodic, and it is a collaborative effort not only between the 4 Beatles, but also between Paul McCartney and George Martin. It is one of the band's most beautiful and heart-rending songs in their entire extensive catalogue, in my opinion. So my question for you this week is, do you agree with that? And if you don't, what song do you think fits the bill? But hey, that's it from me. If you enjoyed this video, I'll leave a link in the description for my Buy Me a Coffee page, where you are welcome to make a donation. If you wish, no pressure, friends. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you here next week. Have a great weekend! Oh, Panda throw there. Oh no. Yuck. Oh my goodness. That's a problem for after filming.